What if the thing quietly holding the modern world together was not a government, not a military alliance, not a technological breakthrough, but a narrow strip of water most people couldn't find on a map without help? Not a continent, not a superpower, just a passage of open ocean, roughly 21 miles wide at its narrowest point, sitting between two coastlines the average person never thinks about. Every single day, thousands of vessels move through this corridor in near total anonymity, tankers the length of skyscrapers, cargo ships carrying the invisible fuel of modern life, moving quietly, predictably, without ceremony, because the world depends on that quiet more than almost anyone stops to realize. Hidden inside that routine is something extraordinary, because nearly 1/5 of the entire world's oil supply passes through this single passage every day. Enough energy to power cities across 6 continents, enough to move food, run factories, keep supply chains breathing. But the true weight of this place goes far deeper than oil. Because long before humans drew borders or built tankers, the planet itself had already shaped the land and sea in a way that made this corridor inevitable. Certain narrow places were always going to become the only way through. Hormuz was always going to matter. The Earth made sure of that. To understand why this place carries the weight it does, you have to stop looking at how small it appears on a map. Because geography has never measured importance by size. It measures importance by connection. And what Hormuz connects is almost incomprehensible in scale. On one side sits the open ocean. On the other side sits the Persian Gulf. And inside that gulf lies one of the greatest concentrations of energy ever formed anywhere on this planet. Saudi Arabia, Iran, Iraq, Kuwait, Qatar, the United Arab Emirates. These are not just names on a map. Together, they sit above close to half of all known petroleum reserves on Earth, half of everything humanity has ever found beneath the ground. And nearly all of it must exit through a single natural doorway. There is no second ocean passage, no hidden alternative route carved by rivers or chance. No back door that engineers discovered and quietly put to use. Just one opening between rock and water, shaped not by human ambition but by geological time, by forces that were moving long before the first civilization ever lit a fire. This is what makes Hormuz different from almost every other strategic location on Earth. It is not important because someone decided it was. It is important because the planet left no other option. The geography here is not a convenience. It is a constraint, a hard physical limit built into the structure of the Earth itself, which means the global energy system is not just an economic construction, it is a geographic one, and geography, unlike policy, cannot be voted out of office. But this story did not begin with oil. It did not begin with supertankers, or energy markets, or the anxious calculations of modern geopolitics. It began thousands of years before any of that existed, when the first merchants realized that this narrow corridor was the only reliable way between two worlds. Trade between ancient Mesopotamia and the civilizations of India passed through these waters. Persian maritime networks used this corridor as the backbone of their commercial power. Goods moved here that shaped empires, spices, textiles, metals, ideas. The strait was already old when history first started writing itself down. Then came the Portuguese, in the 16th century, pushing into the Indian Ocean with warships and ambition, immediately recognizing what the ancient traders had known for millennia. Control this passage, and you influence everything that flows through it. They tried to hold it. Others came after them with the same intention and the same understanding. Later, British naval strategy made Hormuz a central piece of imperial calculation. The logic was never complicated. Wide regions depend on narrow gateways, and whoever watches the gateway holds a kind of quiet power that no army stationed in the open desert could ever replicate. This pattern is not unique to Hormuz. It repeats across the entire map of human history. The Bosporus dividing Europe from Asia, the Suez Canal cutting weeks from global voyages, the Strait of Malacca threading between continents. These are the places where geography quietly becomes strategy, where the Earth itself becomes the most powerful political actor in the room. Hormuz belongs in that same category. It always has. What makes Hormuz especially powerful is not just where it sits on the map. It is how it functions as a bottleneck, and what that bottleneck reveals about the hidden fragility running through the entire modern world. Modern supertankers do not drift freely across open water. They move through designated shipping lanes only a few miles wide, following corridors defined by international maritime rules and the physical limits of safe navigation. Traffic flows through this passage the way blood moves through an artery. Predictable, concentrated, unavoidable. There is no wandering. There is no choosing a different path on a different day. The ships go where the passage allows, and the passage allows very little room. This creates a paradox that most people never think about. As the global economy grows larger and more sophisticated, as supply chains stretch across more continents and connect more billions of people, it becomes more dependent on smaller and smaller physical spaces. The bigger the system gets, the more its survival concentrates into narrow geographic points that the system itself has no power to redesign. Hormuz is one of those points, a place where the enormous scale of global civilization meets the hard, unchanging limits of physical geography, where the ambitions of the modern world press up against something the modern world did not build and cannot move. This is the paradox of globalization that rarely makes it into the conversation. We built a world of extraordinary complexity and reach, and then we made it dependent on corridors of extraordinary smallness. Scale and vulnerability, it turns out, do not cancel each other out. They grow together. And Hormuz is where that uncomfortable truth becomes impossible to ignore. The deeper story of Hormuz does not begin on the surface. It does not begin with ships or borders or the calculations of modern strategy. It begins hundreds of millions of years beneath your feet in a world so ancient and so different from our own that it barely resembles the planet we think we know. The Persian Gulf basin exists because of a slow, grinding collision between two of Earth's great tectonic plates. The Arabian plate pushing northward, the Eurasian plate resisting. This collision, unfolding across tens of millions of years, folded rock into the Zagros Mountains and pressed deep sedimentary basins into the crust below. Vast basins that became traps that became vaults. Inside those vaults, something remarkable happened. Ancient marine life, microscopic organisms, algae, the accumulated biological material of entire vanished ecosystems settled into the sediment over millions of years. Layer after layer after layer, buried under pressure, cooked by the slow heat of the earth, transformed over deep time into something the modern world would eventually call oil. What burns in engines today was once alive. What moves through Hormuz every single day is not just a commodity. It is stored sunlight from ecosystems that disappeared before the first dinosaur ever walked the earth. Ancient biology converted by geological pressure into the fuel that runs modern civilization. This is the hidden system beneath the headlines. This is why Hormuz matters at a level that has nothing to do with politics and everything to do with deep time. The modern world did not create this energy. It simply found it, and the only way out leads through one narrow passage the earth carved long before anyone was here to notice. The numbers alone are difficult to fully absorb. Every single day, somewhere between 17 and 20 million barrels of oil move through this passage. Not in a week, not across a month of careful scheduling. Every day, a volume so large that if you tried to visualize it in physical terms, it would defeat the imagination almost immediately. And oil is not the only thing moving through here. Qatar, sitting on one of the largest natural gas reserves ever discovered, ships its liquefied natural gas through Hormuz to customers across Asia and Europe. The energy needs of entire nations flow through this single corridor with a regularity that the global economy has quietly built itself around without most people ever noticing. This is what makes Hormuz the single most important energy transit choke point on the entire planet. Not one of the most important, the most important. A title the geography here has held for decades and shows no sign of surrendering. But what makes this place truly powerful in the modern sense is not just the volume, it is the sensitivity. Energy markets do not wait for disruption to actually happen before they react. They react to the possibility of disruption, to the rumor of tension, to a single news headline about naval movements in the region. Risk itself carries economic weight here in a way that almost nowhere else on Earth can match. When uncertainty concentrates in a place where geography already concentrates movement, the consequences amplify in ways that feel disproportionate to the cause. A patrol boat in the wrong position, a diplomatic statement delivered in the wrong tone, and within hours, oil prices shift, insurance rates climb, and markets on the other side of the planet quietly absorb the tremor. Hormuz is not just a transport route. It is a global pressure point where geography turns tension into consequence faster than almost any other place on Earth. At some point, in any honest conversation about Hormuz, someone asks the obvious question, the one that feels almost too simple to take seriously. If this single passage carries so much weight, if so much of the modern world depends on it, why not just build another way around it? Why not engineer a solution and remove the vulnerability entirely? It is a reasonable question. It is the kind of question that comes naturally to a civilization that has spent 2 centuries convincing itself that every problem has a technical answer. We bored tunnels through the Alps. We carved a canal through the Isthmus of Panama. We built bridges across straits that sailors once considered uncrossable. Modern engineering has an extraordinary track record of bending geography to human will. So the instinct makes sense. If Hormuz is the problem, build your way out of it. Find the workaround. Apply enough capital and enough engineering ambition and enough political will, and the problem dissolves. But this is exactly where that instinct runs into something it was never designed to handle, because not every problem facing the modern world is an engineering problem waiting for the right solution. Some problems are not technical at all. Some problems are geological. Some problems are written into the physical structure of the Earth, in a language that cranes and excavators and project timelines cannot translate. Hormuz is one of those problems, and the moment you look closely at the terrain surrounding it, the comfortable assumption that we can simply build our way out begins to quietly fall apart. The Earth, it turns out, does not always leave room for the workaround, and Hormuz is one of the clearest places on the map where that truth becomes impossible to argue with. Building an alternative canal sounds straightforward until you actually look at what the terrain around Hormuz demands. And when you look closely, the idea begins to unravel almost immediately. The Suez Canal works because it crosses flat desert, relatively shallow, relatively predictable, a massive engineering achievement, certainly, but one the landscape at least permitted. The Panama Canal works because it crosses a narrow land bridge where the distance between 2 oceans is manageable, and the geology, while challenging, was not impossible. The Earth, in both cases, offered a door. Engineers walked through it. Hormuz offers no such door. The terrain surrounding this strait is defined by mountains, fractured and unstable rock formations, and vast arid plateaus baking under some of the most extreme heat conditions on the planet. Any canal attempting to bypass the strait would require hundreds of miles of excavation through geology that resists every phase of the process. Through fault lines that make the ground unpredictable, through territory that belongs to multiple nations with competing interests and deep historical grievances that no engineering budget has ever successfully purchased away. And even if every geological and political obstacle somehow dissolved, even in the most optimistic scenario imaginable, any artificial canal built here would almost certainly be longer, slower, and less efficient than the natural passage it was designed to replace. Global shipping does not make decisions based on theoretical safety. It makes decisions based on efficiency, on cost per mile, on speed per ton, on the cold mathematics of moving the most cargo for the least money in the least time, which reveals the uncomfortable truth sitting at the center of this entire conversation. You cannot simply engineer your way out of geography. You can work within its limits. You can adapt to them. But you cannot make them disappear. The Earth set the terms here long before humans arrived to negotiate. There is another solution that already exists, and it is worth taking seriously: pipelines. Not as a theoretical future project, but as infrastructure that certain countries have already built specifically because they understood the vulnerability Hormuz represents. Saudi Arabia constructed pipelines reaching all the way to the Red Sea, allowing some of its oil to exit without ever touching the Persian Gulf. The United Arab Emirates built a pipeline to Fujairah, a port sitting outside the strait entirely, precisely to create an alternative when the main passage feels too exposed. These are not small projects. They represent billions of dollars and years of construction driven by a single strategic calculation that, depending entirely on one narrow passage, is a risk worth spending heavily to reduce. And they help. Nobody serious argues otherwise. But helping is not the same as solving, because the scale of what Hormuz moves every day dwarfs what any pipeline network can realistically carry. The strait moves roughly 3 times more oil than all existing bypass pipelines combined. 3 times. That gap does not close easily or quickly. Ships can be added to a fleet in months. Pipelines require a decade from planning to operation. Ships can reroute around emerging threats. Pipelines are fixed into the ground and cannot move an inch. Ships scale to meet global demand across every ocean simultaneously. Pipelines serve specific regional corridors and nothing beyond them. This is the deeper lesson sitting inside the pipeline story. In a world that changes faster than infrastructure can be built, flexibility often matters more than permanence. And the ocean, for all its exposure, still provides a kind of freedom that nothing buried underground can ever fully replace. There is a military reality here that geography created, and no diplomatic agreement has ever fully neutralized. Iran's coastline runs along the northern edge of the strait for its entire length, not near it, along it, which means that missile batteries, naval patrol craft, and surveillance systems positioned on that coastline sit within direct range of every shipping lane running through the passage below. This is not an accident of politics. It is an accident of geology. The same tectonic forces that built the Persian Gulf basin and concentrated energy beneath it also shaped the coastlines that now overlook the only exit. The Earth, in its indifference, handed one nation a geographic advantage over a corridor the entire world depends on. Permanent closure of the strait is not easy. The logistics are complicated, and the international response would be immediate and overwhelming. Nobody serious argues that Iran could simply shut Hormuz down indefinitely without consequences that would consume the region entirely. But permanent closure was never the real threat. Disruption is the real threat. And disruption is a much lower bar to clear. A single incident in the shipping lanes, a credible threat communicated through the right channels at the right moment, naval movements that signal intention without requiring action. These are enough, because in tightly connected global systems, uncertainty travels faster than any ship ever could. Insurance rates rise before a single tanker is touched. Naval escorts are requested before a single shot is fired. Markets reprice risk before the situation fully develops. Hormuz is not just a physical location, it is a psychological pressure point where geography gives tension an address, and the whole world feels it the moment that address appears in the news. What Hormuz ultimately reveals is something much larger than a single choke point on a single map. It reveals something about the nature of the world we built and the world we actually live in, and the quiet gap between those two things that most people never stop to examine. Human civilization has spent the last 2 centuries operating under a particular assumption: that technology moves faster than geography, that engineering ambition eventually outpaces physical limits, that the planet is raw material and human ingenuity is the force that shapes it. It is an assumption with genuine evidence behind it. We have reshaped coastlines, redirected rivers, and connected continents with infrastructure that would have seemed impossible to previous generations. But places like Hormuz push back against that assumption in ways that are difficult to dismiss, because here, the ancient landscape still sets the terms. Here, the decisions made by tectonic forces hundreds of millions of years ago still determine what is possible and what is not. Here, geology is not background. It is the most powerful actor in the room. We build the systems. The Earth defines their limits. We design the trade routes. Geography decides where they must run. We plan the strategy. Terrain determines what that strategy can actually achieve. This is not a failure of human ambition. It is simply the truth of operating on a planet that was already fully formed long before we arrived with our plans and our certainty. Hormuz is one of the places where that truth surfaces most clearly, where geology, geography, and history converge into a single narrow passage that the modern world cannot route around, cannot replace, and cannot afford to ignore. A hidden landscape that quietly shapes everything above it. So the next time you hear the name Strait of Hormuz surface in a headline, it may sound like just another distant dateline attached to another geopolitical tension you were not planning to think about today. But it is more than that. It has always been more than that. It is proof that the modern world still runs through ancient corridors. That global stability, the kind that keeps supply chains moving and lights on and grocery shelves stocked, can depend entirely on narrow passages shaped by forces that finished their work millions of years before the first human being ever looked up at the sky. And maybe the real question was never why Hormuz matters. Maybe the real question is how many other places like it are quietly doing the same thing right now. How many other narrow passages, overlooked coastlines, and ancient geological formations are holding pieces of modern civilization in place without anyone in that civilization stopping to notice? Because the greatest forces shaping the trajectory of human history are not always found in capitals or boardrooms, or the decisions of powerful people in important rooms. Sometimes they are found in the structure of the earth itself, in the landscape, in the deep time written into rock and water and the slow movement of plates that never asked for our permission and never needed it. If you want to understand why the world works the way it does, sometimes you have to stop looking at what humanity built and start looking at what the planet built first. Because the most powerful forces shaping our future are not new. They are ancient, they are silent, and they are hidden just beneath the surface. This is the story the Earth rarely tells openly, and this is where we tell it.